economic strain for many members in our community. So our event this evening, Transparency in Action, Hennepin County Attorney's Office Response to Operation Metro Surge, is part of our commitment to being clear, open, and transparent with everyone about our role and our responsibilities and actions that we've been taking throughout the operation, but ongoing as well. As a local prosecutorial office, our focus remains on community safety, well-being, due process, and ensuring fairness in every decision that we make. And we also understand, when large scale, events and enforcement actions like this occur, questions will naturally arise, right, about what authority local agencies have, different roles, different agencies and levels of government and safety partners have, and what we can and cannot do. And then also how we work together to support our community with trying to do as little harm as possible. So today we're going to walk through what our office knows, kind of what our role has been, and what steps we're taking to support impacted individuals and communities. We will also discuss how we are coordinating with local partners, some federal partners as well, and what we're doing to ensure that we are committed to transparency, and also how we are continuing our response to address the community concerns. We just want to acknowledge too that everyone's experiences are important and we value that. And I want to thank folks who have reached out to our office, contributed, whether it was video, testimony, shared their stories about things that either happened to them or their neighbors. It's really important and it's all been really critical to our office. So again, just want to say thank you all for joining us and I will turn it over to Sasha.
Yes, thank you, Jen, for that wonderful welcome, and really grateful to be here with both of you all today to talk about such an important topic. Before we jump into some questions, I want to make sure that we take a moment, Mary, and just sort of set the tone. So can you give us a general overview of why transparency and accountability, especially in our community right now, is a priority for your office?
First of all, thank you, Jen, and thank you, Sasha, for being here. When I campaigned for this office, I talked about how I think for many people, the criminal legal system is a big black box, and it's really difficult to understand. And if it's hard to understand, it's hard to advocate for what you think is best for your community. So I have been committed throughout my term to be as transparent as we can possibly be. And I know that's incredibly important right now. I live in Minneapolis. I've lived here for decades, and I know I was hearing my community say, we're being occupied by our own federal government, and who is here to help us? And to me, that's about government stepping up and doing the things that are in their lane. And that's what we've been doing at the county attorney's office. And so it's really important to me to be able to talk about exactly what we're doing so that the public understands what we're doing and they can ask more questions. But I know it's really important to people in our community.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Mary. The way that the Operation Metro Surge impacted communities broadly across the Twin Cities has been felt in so many different ways. As I've talked with community members, and as you know, doing work at the national and international level, really being at the center of the federal administration's focus on immigration, put us on a spotlight that I don't think any of us were prepared for. And so it is really great and just that we're taking the time this evening to talk about what your office is doing and what next steps people can expect. So we'll jump in with some questions, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue and hearing more. Can you tell us more about state charges of federal agents? Do they in fact have immunity?
That's probably the question or the statement we heard most from the federal government. We heard it from the vice president. We heard it from many people saying federal agents cannot be touched by state courts, state DAs, because they have absolute immunity. And I can tell you that is not true. It is not true. They do not have absolute immunity. There is a type of immunity that I'm going to be talking about later, but that is as a defense. anytime anyone comes into our state, and in this particular situation, our county, and they commit a crime, we can, as the county attorney's office, charge them. Now, there are particular issues there, which we'll get into and talk about, but they do not have any kind of absolute immunity to engage in unlawful behavior in our community.
And maybe for our viewers who are less familiar with the legal process, can you talk a little bit about what immunity is?
In general, immunity is where if something was absolute immunity, that would mean that you could do whatever you wanted to do, even committing a crime. But you could not be prosecuted for that or held accountable for that because of your, I guess, kind of free card there, your immunity. That's what we mean immunity, that whatever you do, you can't be prosecuted because you have been granted immunity. And that's, as I said before, that's not the case here.
So much legalese, right? I mean, the language is so important as we think about and unpack such an important topic. So just gonna always ask us to be a little bit of a syllabus and a thesaurus for those listening to make sure what people are getting what they need. So we've heard a lot of folks talk about the supremacy clause. Can you explain a little bit more about what that means and really break it down in layman's terms for us?
Sure. So as people know, we are a country, the United States of America. We are made up of individual states. But the concept of the supremacy clause means that, well, let me take a step back. So we have the federal government, as people know, and then we have state government and local government. The idea of the supremacy clause is whose law is supreme over the entire country. That is the federal courts. So the state court, so for instance, if the federal courts, and the federal courts do say we have a First Amendment right to protest, a state court cannot make a law saying, no, you don't. And so the state courts are bound by the supremacy of the federal court. State courts can add protections for their citizens or their community members, but they cannot do anything that lessens people's rights. So the supremacy clause just means the federal government is supreme over state government and state court.
Yes, thank you for that explanation. I think in recent months, we've heard more about federal court here locally than we have in a long time. So people, I'm sure, have questions and thinking about what all of this means. So thanks for that clarification. And as we think about the legal authority and sort of jurisdictional matters at play here, one of the questions that comes up, of course, is how your office is preparing for any potential legal challenges from federal authorities if you all do proceed with charges that would be filed under the state. So can you talk a little bit about what preparation has looked like and how you all are thinking through your options?
So I went to law school many years ago, but these are concepts that I don't remember studying in law school. And I can tell you that local DAs or county attorneys simply don't have to deal with normally. Because what typically happens is somebody comes in Hennepin County and they commit a crime. Law enforcement investigates it. They give that investigation to our office, and then we decide whether charges are appropriate. If we decide to bring charges, those charges are heard here in state court at the government center. Many of you know the government center, and that's typically how the process works. It is not the same if it is a federal agent who has committed a crime, or we think they may have committed a crime. So because of the supremacy clause, and this is how the interplay there. So we have the federal government, and back in the 1800s, the courts decided, hey, if the federal government is to carry out its duties, its laws, that kind of thing, they're going to obviously be going into individual states. And we can't have individual states interfering with what the government is trying to do. So that's the concept of the federal government having supremacy. But that's not a free pass. That's not absolute immunity. But here's what it means. If we, as a local county attorney, decide that there is enough evidence to charge a federal agent, we would do that. And we would file a complaint in state court, right down at the government center. What would probably happen next is that the federal agent would ask a federal court to remove, meaning move it from state court to federal court. They would do what's called a motion. So essentially this is, we would charge a federal agent in state court. That federal agent would ask the federal court here in Minnesota to move the case from state court to federal court. That's kind of straightforward. It's a pretty low threshold there. But what's kind of fascinating about it, and I didn't know this before this happened and we started doing this research, is that even though the case might be moved to federal court, our staff, the local county attorney's office, my staff, would continue to prosecute the case. It does not then have to be picked up by federal prosecutors, because I know people have said to me, well, what happens if you decide to charge and it gets removed to federal court? Does that then mean you have to convince federal prosecutors to prosecute? And the answer is no. We would prosecute. The differences would be, it would be in federal court. And so the jury would be not from Hennepin County only. The jury would be drawn from the Minnesota, essentially. Interestingly, state court law applies in federal court. And that leads to, if there was a conviction, that conviction is not one that could be pardoned by the president. And so I think that that's a critical distinction here. So we have this very, very odd situation where local prosecutors could be charging a federal agent and doing that prosecution in federal court here in the Twin Cities, with a jury of Minnesotans, not just people from Hennepin County. So that's one issue, that whole removal process. Now, here is where the next step here is where that immunity comes in, that it's called supremacy clause immunity. So essentially, a federal agent can say, hey, I was operating within my authority as a federal agent. You know, I'm supposed to be doing these things. I was within my authority to do them. Secondly, what I did within my authority was necessary and reasonable. Sometimes it's referred to with different words, but essentially they have to make a showing that they deserve or they should get that supremacy clause immunity in federal court because they were doing what was required of them or within their authority as part of their job as a federal agent, and they weren't doing anything above and beyond essentially what they're required to do. So if we were to charge any case in state court, we would expect a federal agent to try to move the case to federal court. We would charge it in state court. They would try to remove it to federal court. And by the way, if the federal judge says, no, I think it's more appropriate in state court, it would just stay in state court.
They can kick it back. Okay.
Yeah, kick it back. Yep. So the other thing is we would have to be prepared to defend against an agent making a defense of, hey, I was just acting under my authority and my job, and I didn't do anything more than was necessary and proper. So that's something that has to be litigated before a judge. If the judge decides, no, you are not entitled to that defense, then the case pretty much proceeds the way it normally would in state court. So that's an additional layer of law that we don't have to deal with in federal court. And so we have been doing, along with partners, a great deal of research, trying to look at cases around the country. What does it look like? What kind of evidence is needed? And of course, in these cases, we also have the barrier of the federal government not giving us any of the evidence that they have obtained as in any of these investigations.
And I imagine that there's not much precedence as you're looking across, other places. This is such an unusual set of circumstances that we found with Metro Surge. Have you guys seen much, or is it just sort of, out there doing the best that you can to try to gather information should you all decide to proceed with anything?
It's very new. In fact, sometimes we talk about it as building the plane as we're flying it. There aren't a lot of cases on some of these issues, and they're very fact specific. In other words, you look at a case and then you think of, okay, well, here are the facts in that case. The federal officer, in fact, where this comes from was, I think, a case from 1890 or something like that, where a federal agent was guarding a federal judge on a train, if I recall, something like that. And somebody attacked the federal judge and the agent killed the person in that attack. And then the state court wanted to file charges and prosecute the federal agent for having committed a crime in their mind in that jurisdiction. So that's kind of where this case law comes from. And if we're looking at cases from the 1800s, there's not a lot of law here. Different courts rule in different ways. And a lot of what we're doing and engaging in is some strategy about, okay, what would this look like if we did this with these specific facts? So it's new. I think in some respects, these would be the first of its kind, or if we did charge first of its kind case in the country in some ways, given some of the issues here. And so I do feel pretty good about the research that our partners have been able to do and kind of where we're at in understanding what the law is, which doesn't mean we can predict what judges would do, but I think we have a pretty good handle on what the law is.
Oh, we do not take gambles on predicting what judges will do, right?
We do not. We do not.
We do our best and then we see what happens. You mentioned two things, Mary, that I want to circle back on a little bit. You talked throughout this conversation so far about partnership. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the partnership with the AG's office and your office has been like in concern with these cases? I know that, you're at the county level. We've talked a bit about how the state is impacted. So maybe give us a little bit of insight on what that partnership has and could look like.
Yeah, it was very apparent that Minnesotans really needed a united front on this. They were feeling under siege, occupied. They wanted somebody in local government to step up and really talk about what was going on here. So we invited the Attorney General to join us in these in this research, in these potential prosecutions. And actually, we've done some litigation related to the Preddy case when the federal agents blocked the BCA from actually doing any investigation. We filed a lawsuit that afternoon. In any event, we have invited the Attorney General's office to join us. Our office is lead on these three shootings and also a separate transparency and accountability project that I know we'll be talking about. But we've been working together on that, on everything that we do. We have twice weekly meetings, maybe more, with them. We also are working with two organizations out of Washington, D.C. One is called the Washington Litigation Group, WLG, and the other is ICAP. And that is the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, which I had to look at my paper with because we were just referred to it as ICAP and I had forgotten what the acronym is. They are both, both of those organizations have experts, like the top experts in the country, probably on federal litigation of this type. And they're working with us pro bono. So it is not costing our office or taxpayers any money at all. And we're extremely fortunate to be able to partner with them to get their expertise on what we might expect here.
Great. I'm really glad to hear that that kind of partnership has been established on such an important matter. Obviously, as I said before, all eyes are on Minnesota, and I think people are paying close attention to what happens here in anticipation of what could happen over the next couple of years as these immigration policies roll into other communities. With that being said, we would be remiss not to talk about the loss of life that has taken place here. Renee Good, Alex Preddy, Mr. Sosa Silas, we want to acknowledge the loss of life. And I just wonder, has your office done anything to support those families of the shooting victims to date?
Yes, our office has a fantastic team of victim service specialists, and they have reached out to the families and Mr. Sosa Solis and their lawyers. As I think people can imagine, nobody anticipates that their loved one is going to be shot and killed or that they're going to be shot. And there are just all kinds of issues that are just foreign, and nobody should have reason to understand. Our victim witness people are fantastic, very culturally specific as well, but they are expert in walking people through, here's what you can expect, and then here's how you might achieve this, and here's what's going to happen. So yes, we have been in contact with all three families.
That's, good and important to hear. I know that victim services are so important, whether it's a circumstance like this or community violence. We know that that immediate wraparound service to families and impacted parties by violence who are survivors can really make the difference in navigating systems and understanding what resources are available. So great to hear that. As we, continue to talk about sort of legal authority and jurisdictional capacity, I have two more questions, and then we're going to pivot to some other things. So quickly, we hear a lot about pardons. You addressed this before, but I want to make sure we're making it plain for the listeners. If these cases were to go to federal court, could Trump pardon? We hear a lot about pardons. So let's talk about that for a moment.
It's really important because we know Trump has pardoned a lot of people. And there was talk of Trump pardoning Chauvin. So I think that was front and center in people's minds here. And so I can say if there are convictions on these cases, even if they are in federal court, Trump cannot pardon people because they are actually state convictions. And that's actually, we are prosecuting the Belcher case. Because of the supremacy clause, we have to wait until after the federal government is done with their case. But one thing that's really important about that is that there would be no possibility for a pardon should Belcher be convicted.
Thank you. I think it's important to sort of clear that up and set some expectations for folks as we, sort of think about what may come next. Lastly, do you believe that these cases will be concluded by the end of your term?
I would say not concluded. So people have asked, so I think most people know the federal government has not cooperated with local law enforcement, particularly our state BCA, which is the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. They are actually the team that is supposed to come in or does come in on any peace officer deadly use of force in Minnesota, if it's a licensed Minnesota police officer, peace officer. And they were denied access in all three cases. In Renee Good's situation, I had talked to somebody from the U.S. Attorney's Office and the BCA and the FBI. We were having these informal conversations, which is what always happens because the norm here is that people work together. In fact, we did that in the Belcher case. There was the FBI and the BCA both doing investigations. The FBI has charged, we have charged. So there's nothing, it is the culture here that everybody worked together. But even though we all agreed that there would be a joint investigation, the BCA was told that they were kicked out of the investigation, and that directive came from Washington, D.C. And so that has been an unusual piece of this because most of the time, to put it in perspective, we still don't have verification of the officers that shot Alex Preddy. So I know that they've been identified by the media, but we actually don't have that information verified independently, which we normally would. Nobody would keep that from us. In fact, in Minnesota, officers are identified. If they shoot and kill someone, they're put on administrative leave, and then there's an investigation, and they either go back to work or they don't. So that's not happening. And because of that, we have had to engage in some processes which are very different. So people have said to me, well, why don't you just subpoena the information that you need? Like officer names and training and all of that, personnel files, that kind of thing. And while we could do that if it was a state agency, and we wouldn't need to do it if it was state and people were cooperating, we can't just subpoena the federal agencies, because the Supreme Court decided that it could be really onerous on federal agencies if people subpoenaed information from them. They created a process. And so essentially we had to make demands. We had to send letters to the Department of Homeland Security and ICE demanding the information that we were denied access to on all three cases. That process is called TOUHY, TOUHY, and it's just based on a Supreme Court case. So essentially there was a process we had to go through to demand certain information and to make a case to the federal agency as to why we should get that information. And then the idea is that those federal agencies are supposed to evaluate our request and then just tell us yes or no, or yes to part of it. So the difficulty is too, there are no internal rules about how long they have to make those decisions. And so, yeah, it's very frustrating because they don't have to respond within 30 days or 60 days or even 90 days or a year for that matter. And it is really up to the federal courts to decide whether withholding information, denying our request was appropriate or not. And so we made those demands in all three cases, Preddy, Good, and Sosa Solis. We did not get the information we were seeking. And so we are preparing, for the next step on that. So this is all civil in nature. And I want to be very clear to people. Criminal is, when you see somebody charged with a crime, that is criminal. But the process of trying to get information from the federal government is civil. And if they're not going to give it to you, you have to file a civil lawsuit in federal court. And that process can take many, many months. And so it's hard to know how long that will play out and take to play out, to have a court make a ruling and perhaps an appeal on it. But at the same time, I want to be clear with people. We could, if we felt that we had enough information to go ahead, we could go ahead with criminal charges while that civil litigation seeking that information is still going on. So I think that adds a layer of where people can see how complex it is. And so, yes. And so in terms of like, what are we thinking about in terms of charging? So I've said to people that, most cases we get are not perfect. They're missing certain aspects of evidence we wished we had. That's certainly true in these cases. I mean, normally you would want the gun, the ballistics, the car that Renee Good was in.
As they say, the smoking gun, right?
Yes. However, what I've said about that is we know Renee Good was shot and killed. We know Alex Preddy was shot and killed. And we know Mr. Sosa Solis was shot in the thigh. So we know that. And is the caliber of gun important? Probably not. What's probably more important is the medical examiner report, the autopsy that tells us what shots hit them and from what direction. And so if we don't get any information from the federal government, and that is kind of dependent on whether they decide to cooperate, whether we prevail on these TOUHY claims, we have to make the decision of, okay, if we went ahead and charged, do we have enough information now to be able to have the case, to be able to defend against the removal motion to federal court and the immunity defense? And that's a situation where you have to think about, you don't know what you don't know. So we don't know, we don't have any statements by federal agents. We don't know what the other agents would say who happen to be there. And so it's a lot of, well, what could they say? And what would we respond to? And so the investigation into all three of these cases has been ongoing for quite some time. The BCA has been doing interviews and collecting evidence. We're pretty close to having most of that, I think, in the Good case. And so it's a matter of sitting down and really thinking through, what are the things we really want to have and we need to have, or we'd like to have, and where are we with this? And it's just like any other case. The standard is not different. We have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But we have to be able to get past the immunity defense. So it's looking at all of the facts that we have and seeing if there's any additional information that we can get that could help on those fronts, and then making an evaluation of, do we have a case here or not at this time? Do we feel comfortable going ahead at this time? So it is very complex. And at the same time, I was actually talking to somebody about this morning. I was saying, if I was on the outside looking in, I would wonder what we were doing all the time. Like, what?
I think for sure people are, yes.
Yeah, they are. And I know, and I do understand that. And then I think the hours we spend every day in meetings about this, but it's really impossible to describe. But our team is putting in many hours on weekends and nights, working really hard on this. And I've touched on some of the complications here and the things. I mean, we're trying to be very methodical and thoughtful going forward, because it's important to get this right. And yet we also know that, I'm sure there are people out there saying, oh, there's never going to be any accountability. And I can't guarantee what the end result will be, but I can guarantee that we are in good shape moving forward. I can't give timelines because that would be artificial. And I don't want to, say, oh, we're going to do this by this date, because things come up. But I feel as though we're in pretty good shape right now, and we're doing the things that we need to do moving forward.
I think that's great, good and important to be sharing with the public, right? People need to feel like they understand what is happening, what could happen, and how to at least have some level of anticipation of what some possible next steps are. And so with that, you talked a little bit about accountability, but a couple of weeks ago, you announced this transparency and accountability project. Could you explain the scope and timeline of that and the 17 plus incidents that are currently under investigation?
Yeah, like everybody, we were looking at all the videos that everybody sees on social media, on TV. And there certainly are a number of videos where it appeared that there was unlawful behavior by federal agents. Now, you can never know for sure because you might see one view of a video, or you might not know what happened before that or after that. But certainly on its surface, we were seeing video and also hearing reports from people about what was happening to them, what federal agents were doing to them. And I know that there was great frustration on the part of community. And that goes back to what I said at the beginning of, the federal government is not only here against our will, because nobody asked the federal government to come in here. And I think one thing that's helpful on that front, when I think back to, and I've been in Hennepin County, by the way, for 35 years. I spent my entire career there. So before this administration, ICE existed. And what would typically happen was they would let the process play out in court. And so in other words, if somebody was not documented, if they were convicted of certain things, then ICE would decide, is this somebody we want to proceed with deportation or whatever it was. And so that has happened for years. And there was no influx of immigrants who were committing crimes. In fact, we know by the government's own data, which they have taken down since Trump got into office, that people who are born in the United States commit crimes at a higher rate than immigrants. So this is not about public safety. None of this was about public safety. None of it was about fraud. This is not how you investigate. It's kind of
you would think there would be like very different set of characters here if this was about the fraud, that's for sure.
Forensic accountants, perhaps, or people that look at records and stuff like that. So none of this was about public safety. In fact, I could talk to you about the things that make it clear it was not about public safety. But it certainly wasn't because our immigrant neighbors were committing crimes at any higher rate or anything like that. And if somebody commits a crime here, it's investigated. If appropriate, a case is submitted to us, and if appropriate, we charge and hold somebody accountable. That's the process that happens. And then if ICE thinks that, then they take over, and if they decide they want to seek deportation, they did that separately. So that's the way
I can actually chime in there, because I, many moons ago, as you said, some decades back, worked for the Department of Corrections and was very much a part at times of that kind of circumstance, right? It didn't happen all, at every single incident, but there were certainly cases of undocumented folks who ICE decided were candidates for deportation based on the circumstances, and they would, at the end of their term, come and take them into custody for removal. So we know that those things have happened for decades in Minnesota's system, and I don't believe that they had changed. So to your point,
no, not at all. In fact, the Department of Corrections would cooperate with ICE and tell ICE if a person was nearing the end of their term. So nothing changed about that. And primarily, I don't really recall, although I may not have known this, but certainly ICE was not focusing on folks who were here just because they were non-documented. They were really looking at people who committed certain types of crimes. It did depend on who the president was and what their priorities were, but they were not here trying to deport people who were here working with their families, that kind of thing, who weren't committing any crimes. And by the way, being in the country without paperwork is not a criminal offense. So when we talk about civil immigration enforcement, that's what ICE is charged with doing. They don't do criminal enforcement. So,
and even that civil enforcement historically has been focused on, in Trump's own words, the worst of the worst. This does feel like a pivot, right? It had historically been focused on people with multiple felonies, very heinous behaviors, where removal felt like the most appropriate response after they had served their sentence locally. This pivot to sort of these civil violations does feel very new under this administration, I think, to most of us working in government.
Absolutely. We've never seen anything like this before. And so none of us asked for this. And I've now forgotten the question you asked because I took a very long detour.
You were just giving us a bit of information and insight into the TAP, the Transparency and Accountability Project that you launched just a few weeks ago.
Thank you for
reminding me. But as always, we've gotten into a very dynamic conversation, and relevant information has been shared.
So, we would see these videos where people were dragged out of their cars, or just the videos that I think everybody's seen, where it certainly appeared that a crime may have been committed, but certainly called out for investigation. And that just didn't seem to be happening. And so we created this Transparency and Accountability Project, TAP, and we started out investigating, I think, 17 cases. And we had a press conference about it. We only talked about 2 of the cases we were looking into: Bovino throwing gas at people who were standing in a park, essentially, who weren't doing anything other than protesting, and then what happened at Roosevelt High School. We didn't talk about the other cases because many involved vulnerable immigrants, and we didn't want to be outing them and creating more problems for them. So I'm just looking at some data here. As of today, we are now working on 21 cases. We've gotten 327 submissions for video and photo. As you know, we opened up a portal or a place where people can report what they had seen or heard. So we now have 327 submissions. We have 24 recorded interviews taken in person from citizen witnesses and victims. And so we're doing a lot on these instances. And my goal and our goal is really to do as much investigation as we can, in the hope that if, there may be some incidents where we find out that really nothing unlawful happened. There also are going to be instances where something inappropriate happened, but it wasn't a crime. And then there may be instances where there was a crime. And then the question is, do we actually know who did it? Because as we know, federal agents were wearing masks, and sometimes it's hard to identify them. But if we can, and somebody committed a crime, our goal would be to try to hold them accountable. And all the rules, the federal rules I've been talking about, would also apply in those cases. But we did this because it was really important. You know, people in our community were saying, what happened to the laws? Why this occupying force seems to be, you know, harming people and violating people's rights, their First Amendment rights, and actually committing crimes. Who is here to help us? And so we wanted to answer that call and at least document and investigate as much as we could. And if there was a possibility for accountability or at least transparency, we would try to provide that.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Mary. As I've been, you know, in other cities and talking with colleagues across the country, one of the questions that came up certainly during the occupation was, well, are they allowed to do that? Are they allowed to go into people's homes and behave this way? And certainly in the midst of the stress, my response was often, well, who's going to stop them, right? And so we know that, you know, there were limitations of what local officials and law enforcement could do, variety of reasons, and that's not what we're here for. But I think it is very good and important that investigations are happening, and that hopefully if there's opportunities for people to be held accountable for any infractions in the law, that your office is looking into that. So thank you. With that in mind,
can I follow up a little bit on that?
Course.
In that I did have these conversations, some of these conversations with local law enforcement. And it was actually surprising to me, and maybe it should have been surprising, but they were hearing what the administration was saying too. They were hearing, oh, federal agents have absolute immunity. So I was telling them, no, they don't. And that's really a legal question, and we would help you with that. And I was telling them, you know, go ahead and investigate the way you would normally investigate. And yes, there may be some barriers. Like I said to them, so if you asked a federal agent to identify themselves, do you think that they would? And the chief said no. So obviously that could be an issue. But I said to them, you have jurisdiction. You can investigate just like any other crime. We will help you. The BCA was on that call and also said that they would talk local law enforcement through that. But there were various reasons why they were reluctant to do that. And ultimately, we didn't get any cases submitted by any local law enforcement about anything that happened, at least by federal agents.
So yeah, that's helpful background. Thank you for sharing that. You know, these matters of law enforcement and sort of then the legalities, I think, for people who are just living and existing in their communities and who have been subjected to this kind of, you know, operation, there's a lot of questions and a lot of, you know, lack of clarity. So I think every opportunity we have to explain whose role and responsibility is what, as people look backwards, will be very, very important. But given that you are at the county attorney level and that so many counties were impacted by the Metro Surge operation, you know, do you believe that county by county approaches can realistically produce accountability? I know you mentioned that you guys are in partnership with the AG's office. You know, is this something that would be better handled there? Do you feel like each county should really be taking this on at its merit on their own? I'd love to hear just a little bit more about your approach and take on that.
First of all, the AG cannot introduce themselves into counties. The county attorney has to invite them in, which we did. But, you know, I guess that's a question of, we have county attorneys in almost every county. It's an elected position. It in many ways is going to depend on the politics of the person. In fact, to give you an idea, outside Minnesota, in Cook County, which is Chicago, the new DA there had said publicly, I think, that she could not do anything about it, and was actually questioned by somebody, I think, in their legislature, while they're doing it in Hennepin County, why can't you do it here? So I think in some respects, it's been made into a political issue, and to me, it shouldn't be. It really is about, you know, did they engage in unlawful behavior? And to me, and this is one thing I said to the police chiefs too, it doesn't matter whether you support ICE or not. The issue that is before us in the courts, in the legal system, is are we going to investigate what appears to be unlawful behavior? And as prosecutors, what are we going to do about that? That says nothing about whether you support ICE or not. So I push back when people say it's a political issue. And I do believe that every county attorney should be looking at instances that happened in their counties and trying to seek accountability if it appears something unlawful happened.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you wholeheartedly that this issue has become hyper politicized, and I am looking forward to seeing how counties across the Twin Cities, as well as in other states, take this on, because I think it will speak to their public record for now and for, for the history of their time in office. So thank you for that highlight. The last question sort of in this round that I want to make sure we cover is, you talked about people still being able to tap into the portal and provide information about things that they experienced or that they saw. And quite frankly, people are afraid, I think the intimidation tactics and the things that have happened, the trauma that residents of Hennepin County, the Twin Cities at large, have experienced, going back many generations as far as interactions with government and systems. More recently, the unrest that followed George Floyd's murder and the murder of George Floyd here, the faith in systems and the faith that systems can protect people if they do come forward, I think feels limited. So can you talk a little bit about, especially for vulnerable individuals who are concerned about retaliation, what measures are being taken to keep them safe if they do come forward?
That's a very real issue, and I completely understand. I mean, people, I would say anybody who didn't have white skin was probably afraid to go out of their house. And we certainly heard story after story that people were racially profiled. In fact, a federal judge found that. Federal agents were racially profiling people. And so, I mean, there were a couple of arrests, very violent arrests. One of them in the Hennepin County Government Center, a person who we had charged with a drug crime actually came to court, and as he was leaving his appearance and he was down in the Skyway level, actually got tackled by a federal agent. And we were attempting to prosecute him, and his co-defendant was supposed to come to court that afternoon and didn't come, obviously, because he knew ICE would be there. So it's scary. And when those instances happen, people in our office, our staff, were frightened. They didn't want to go outside security or outside their offices because they thought they would be profiled. We know from our Domestic Abuse Service Center, or DASC, that people who are calling in are saying that they're afraid. So DASC is it's part of the county attorney's office, but it's also separate. Our staff meets people where they are, and if they don't want to prosecute and they just want a safety plan, that's what they help them do. So they are hearing from people who are frightened to report the fact that they've been the victims of assault and abuse because they don't know what's going to happen to them. We know we've had witnesses and victims say they're not going to come to court because they're afraid. And this goes back to when you and I were talking about, this isn't about public safety. How in the world can it be about public safety when you're scaring victims from calling the police, or witnesses and victims from coming to court to testify about what happened to them? Or you're deporting people that we are trying to prosecute for crimes to hold them accountable. So I think it's really difficult. And I think, we are doing some things. We do certify UNT visas. That certification provides some kind of sliver of protection for somebody who's undocumented if they've been the victim of a crime. And so we do that to try to help them. We actually certified over 500 of them last year alone. So we continue to try to do that. We're doing preparation with witnesses and victims coming up for court virtually rather than having them come downtown. The Attorney General and I and John Choi, the Ramsey County Attorney, and the City Attorney for both Minneapolis and St. Paul, wrote a second letter to the Chief Justice, Natalie Hudson. We had written her a letter, I believe, a year ago, January, asking her to use her what's called inherent authority to declare the buildings where courthouses are located off limits to ICE. That was critical because any judge in their own courtroom can say, ICE, you can't come in here. Judges do have the authority to run their courtrooms, but they do not have the authority to tell ICE to stay out of the hallways where there's only one way out, and ICE can sit there and wait for somebody to come in or out. Individual judges don't have the authority to keep ICE out of the government center or the public service level where they tackled somebody. And so we made that request of her over a year ago. She declined at that point. So we wrote another letter, I think in January of this year or February, and we documented instances of what had happened in the Hennepin County Government Center and said, hey, a year ago, we predicted that this stuff might happen. Now we have actual documentation of it happening, and it is hurting public safety. And frankly, for anybody who's been to the government center, people come there for all kinds of business. They come there to get licenses, to pay their tax. I mean, all kinds of things. And when you have
pay tickets, get birth certificates. I mean, there's lots and lots of reasons you may need to come there.
Absolutely. And you can't have your community members afraid to walk into their courthouse because ICE is hanging around there. And so we asked her once again to exercise her inherent authority, and she declined to do that again. But we also found out that she had it was a secret meeting with Holman, and she had asked him to she had made 5 requests. Like, don't carry long guns into the courthouse, don't arrest people in the courthouse. He responded by saying that they would not arrest people in the courthouse unless it was a public safety concern. But what does that mean exactly? And what is the difference between a long gun and a handgun? I mean,
optics, that would be the difference, optics.
Right. And they would not go into courtrooms. Well, individual judges could also already tell them not to go in courtrooms. And the thing about it too is when you have a secret meeting that you only find out about because evidently the media got involved, how does that help witnesses and victims and anybody else feel safe coming to the court? And then 4 days after that agreement was made, that is when ICE was there and tackled the man that we had charged with a drug case. So, there's a lot of mistrust with federal government right now, understandably. And so that was really disappointing that she declined to declare the government center and other buildings which house courtrooms off limits to ICE, because I think we're still going to see this behavior and people are still going to be afraid. So we also have a staff that's very multicultural, multilingual. And so we at least have people who look like the people that we serve. But to be honest with you, just government anyway, I think people who are vulnerable don't trust. And I understand that. And also law enforcement, how, when we have the separation ordinance and when people say we don't help ICE, this was something that I talked to the sheriff about actually. And I had said a lot of, if you show up at a scene and ICE is there, and you're just saying you're directing traffic and you're, not doing anything else, how do community members know that? I mean, define what you mean by assisting ICE or not assisting ICE, because I don't know how you expect community members to understand the difference. So I think that there's been a lot of damage done, and I frankly don't know how you put it back together. I talk about how much damage, and you and Jen were talking about how much trauma has done. I mean, we have like Renee Good, who was shot and killed in front of her partner, who had to go tell Renee's child, who was in school, that her mother was deceased and her father had died. I mean, there's nothing that can take that. Or Alex Preddy. I mean, that's, they're lost to their loved ones forever. There's no undoing of that damage. How do you undo businesses being closed? How do you undo children? I don't know a single parent where I work in the government center that didn't have to have the conversation with their 5-year-old, 6-year-old who was afraid to go to school because they were afraid they were going to get taken away by ICE or their classmate was going to get taken away. How do you undo that? I don't know. How do you undo all the businesses that close? How do you undo all the because workers aren't, how do you undo people who got deported and their kids are still here? I mean, I just, we could go on and on and on about the damage that was done here, and you can't undo it. And it's tragic. And I mean, I think this is why we need to keep talking about it, because the consequences of this are horrific.
Well, they're long and vast, and I don't think, to your point, that there's anyone who lives in the Twin Cities who's been untouched by the impacts, whether you are immediately impacted because loved ones of yours have been, deported or detained or engaged with ICE, or the simple idea of living in an occupied space. I think it's a very foreign concept for most Americans, and the Twin Cities had a unique experience with it for a pretty prolonged period of time. And so I think we're going to be seeing the lasting physical and mental health effects of this for some time. We talk about COVID and, sort of COVID kids, what's going to be the outcome for these young people who were in isolation for such a long time. And I think for the Twin Cities, we're going to have a similar outcome related to this experience. I have a 6-year-old grandson, and so having some of those same conversations about his experience, we're still unpacking that. One of his classmates, the family made the difficult decision to pull him from school because they were concerned that they would be impacted. Certainly don't know their legal status or how they arrived at that decision, but one day a close classmate was there and the next day he was gone. And that's disturbing when you know the reasons. And as we talked with him about it, my grandson shared, because my family is also part Latino, that these 2 5- and 6-year-olds have been, navigating identity politics at the lunchroom table, right? That my grandson, who, phenotypically looks African-American, says to me, well, I can go to school because I don't look Mexican, but my friend looks Mexican, so he can't come to school anymore, right? So when we think about the navigation of the real-time impact on our children, we know that there's some trauma that we'll likely need to unpack. And so it's important that we're thinking about it. And I'm grateful that there are victim services available for folks. But I think you're right. It's going to take more than what any one entity of government or service can provide to get us through. Even as strong Minnesotans, we're going to need some help and support. So quickly, beyond the TAP portal, will your office continue to provide regular public updates on the individual cases and overall findings as things are decided and things proceed?
Yes, absolutely. I think transparency, going back to transparency, is really important. And I think, for instance, I updated our TAP submissions here at 327. Probably by tomorrow, it'll be something more than that. So yes, we are trying to do the best we can to talk about this in forums such as this, and also issue press releases or press conferences where it seems important that mark certain things that we're doing that we think the public really would like to know about. So that is absolutely our goal, and we will continue to try to be as transparent as possible.
I think that's the only thing that we can do at this point. Transparency is going to be so key in this process. And we know that, cases have to be built and information has to be gathered, and that can take time. But I think people want to know what's happening. And to your earlier point, it can't be understated or overstated how deeply the community here has been impacted. Is there anything else that you want to share about what your office is doing as it relates to the community's impact and how we're working to rebuild trust in government? I am continuously saying, whether it's in my traditional work around community safety, or in this case, that most communities, non-mainstream communities, interface with government in ways that almost always feel punitive. And I think this engagement of ICE both gave undocumented communities and others that experience, but also our predominantly white communities had the opportunity to experience what occupation feels like and to not feel like they could move safely through community. And so how do we navigate that? Any thoughts or reflections you might share, as a white-bodied member of community?
Yeah, it's very different from George Floyd. Very different.
It is.
I want to say that up front. And at the same time, I remember when George Floyd was happening, I thought I was seeing a lot of white people react in different ways. It was like, oh, I'm seeing with my own eyes on video. My cat's bumping up against my computer here. Sorry. People saw with their own eyes what happened to George Floyd. Now, some people refuse to acknowledge that, but at least at that point, we saw Black Lives Matter signs everywhere and that kind of thing. And I remember thinking, oh, maybe this is a tipping point where white people will kind of try to look in the mirror and really gain some insight into what happens here to other communities. And as you know, there was a big pendulum shift back. This situation, I find when I talk about this, I've had the opportunity and the privilege to talk about this nationally a lot. I can't convey the length to which community came together here in ways that I keep hearing about. It's the driving kids to school. It's bringing meals to people who don't feel like they can go out. It was the paying people's rent. It was showing up with whistles. And it was so much more than that, too. And in my mind, it really is our community that drove ICE out to the extent that they're out of here. We know they're still around. And that's important. And I think there were a lot of white people seeing the things that were happening and saying, well, this is not right. And I think so many people don't think about until a situation like this, hey, my neighbor comes from someplace other than here, and I like them. And I go to my favorite food place and the workers there and I like them. And there were these connections where people were understanding and maybe able to dismiss the narrative that somehow immigrants are here to, I don't know, do what, but that they are an essential part of our community, really an essential part of our community. And they bring so much to the community. And I think many more people were saying, well, this isn't right. Like, maybe I agree kind of with we need immigration reform, but I don't agree with this. I don't agree with this at all. And so, and maybe this is just wishful thinking because I'm relatively optimistic. I'm hoping that more and more people recognize what other people who aren't white have to go through, the things that they have to think about just to leave the house or just to think about their child leaving their house. Another thing that I want people to know about was I was part of a new coalition of 9 DAs, essentially county attorneys from around the country, and the acronym is FAFO, but it is the coalition in the fight against federal overreach, and it's essentially about sharing resources, sharing knowledge about what happened here. And we had a convening in Washington, D.C. about a month ago, and we were hearing from the federal partners that we are working with at Georgetown and the other partners I mentioned, and they came to talk to the other DAs about, here's what you need to be aware of should this come to you, and you have to learn about the legal issues. And I was sitting kind of in the back of the room, and what I could offer was to say, here is what I wish I would have known to my fellow DAs. And it was amazing seeing these federal partners kind of educate my colleagues and sitting back there thinking, you know what, we are leading the country here. We are absolutely leading the country in what's happening here. And I can't think of a better team to do it. I mean, we have an amazing team. And in partnership with the AG and the federal partners, I could not be more proud or happier that this is the team that is building this airplane as we are flying it. I think we are the right people to do it, which says a lot. And my fellow DAs, and I hear all around the country too, I'm hearing from all kinds of people that Minnesotans are an inspiration to everybody else in this country, and that there are things that we can do to fight back against this administration and against its hateful policies. And so that is another reflection, having heard from many colleagues, many people I know from around the country, that what happened here is terrible and traumatic, and we'll be feeling it for a long time. it was also inspirational to the rest of the country, and indeed in some parts of the world, I've heard from people, and that we are leading the way in trying to seek accountability for government overreach. And so, I don't know where this is going to end up, but I do know that Minnesotans really inspired the rest of the country, and that the work that we are doing and others are doing is kind of creating a roadmap for other states. And I know some of my colleagues are preparing for this. If this comes to our city, this is what we're going to do. And then my hope is actually by doing this, by talking about this, that maybe we won't see something as extreme as this again. Because when you're being told by Bovino and whoever, nobody can touch you, you have absolute immunity, when you know you don't, and a community says, we're not going to stand for this, our community members or DAs are saying, nope, you do not have absolute immunity, and we are going to investigate you, and if appropriate, we are going to charge you. I think that's a big deterrent. And so I think we are, as a community, as a state, leading the country in what you can do to fight back. And I can guarantee you that people from other states are looking at us and following what we have done. And by we, I mean primarily the community, because I'm going to continue to say it was community members standing up that really caused this to blow up in the media all across the world, and really led a majority of ICE to leave.
Yes, the organizing on the ground and in community has been remarkable. And as we think about that thread of connectivity between the experience that Minneapolis had when George Floyd was murdered and the experience of Operation Metro Surge, I think the connective tissue is really that there was preparation in it. I think when George Floyd was murdered, people felt, of course, aghast at what they saw on television, but then the immediacy of sort of turmoil and unrest in the city, people quickly operationalized and prepared to navigate it. But I think it forced people to really get to know their neighbors, to identify what would I do if I find myself in a crisis of this again. And so building those hyper-local networks, I think, in the midst of tragedy in 2020, really mobilized Minneapolis and the Twin Cities to be able to respond to this Metro Surge the way that we did. And so I also am so impressed with what we were able to see happen here. It is the heart of Minnesotans that really showed up and showed out in opposition to the behaviors that we saw that felt fueled by hate and anger. And so I'm proud, always proud to be a Minnesotan, but particularly proud under these circumstances. So as we talk about, the protests, can you talk a little bit about your office's response to some of those protests, particularly the peaceful ones? We know that there are people engaged in ongoing daily protests at the Whipple building. And has your office received any cases resulting from the arrests of protesters?
So our office at the county attorney's office primarily prosecutes felonies, adult felonies. And those are your more serious crimes. What are called misdemeanors are lower level crimes. That would be your disorderly conduct, trespass, that kind of thing. Most of the time, those are prosecuted by the city attorney in the city where those things happen. So if somebody's disorderly in Minnetonka, that would be prosecuted by the Minnetonka City Attorney's Office, not us. So Whipple is unique. Whipple is Fort Snelling. It's not a city. And so that is why the sheriff has jurisdiction there. That's why you see sheriff's deputies there. And those cases, that's why we have jurisdiction there as well. So whether it's a petty misdemeanor, which is like a parking ticket, a really low level thing, or a misdemeanor or a felony, whatever it is, we have jurisdiction over it if it happens at Whipple. Something unique is that normally there's an investigation done on a case and it's submitted to us by law enforcement, and then our lawyers look at it to see if they think charges are appropriate. That's the normal process. And so something is not charged unless we decide that we want to charge it. It's a crime, that kind of thing. The process is very different at Whipple, or just in a park in general, like Fort Snelling. So the sheriff's office decides whether to arrest people, whether to hold them, to cite them, that kind of thing. Now, most of the cases that we have seen from Whipple have been misdemeanor level. And so they get charged and then they're put on a calendar. I won't go into the weeds on that, but they're put on a special calendar. And we don't make decisions about whether to charge those or not. They're put there by the sheriff's office. When we get body cam video, everything, police reports that we want, we can then look at those cases and decide whether it's something we want to go forward with. So I think it's important for people to know we are not charging people at Whipple. That is something that the sheriff's office that's the decision they make. Now, there have been a lot of protests out there. I went out there once to just kind of look around and see where people were, and there are a lot of fencing, that kind of thing. We have been engaged in ongoing conversations with the sheriff. And I should say the sheriff, Dewana Witt, is an elected, just like me. She can make decisions about policy, that kind of thing. But because we are the entity that has jurisdiction over those cases, just like any other law enforcement, we would be connecting with them and saying, hey, what are you thinking about here? And specifically what we've tried to connect with them on is many of the cases that we're getting are not as a result of specific conduct somebody's doing, but they are protesting, people are yelling, that kind of thing. And then the sheriff's office issues what's called a dispersal order. In other words, they get on a megaphone and they say, leave. You have to leave. We're telling you to leave. And if you don't leave, you're going to be arrested. And then people have seen the videos of people getting arrested, some of whom are running away. And so we've been having conversations with them, and I've been having conversations as well about, hey, people have a right to peacefully protest. They have a right to peacefully protest. And that means they can say things, unpleasant things. That is our right under the Constitution, under the First Amendment. And so they do have those rights, and they should not be arrested for exercising those rights or for being there when a dispersal order is given, and then just being there. So as a result, we have actually dismissed quite a few cases that have been coming through there. Certainly a case where a law enforcement officer is directly assaulted. We had one where somebody spit in the face of law enforcement. We prosecute those, but other cases we have dismissed because there is a balance there between exercising the First Amendment right and the dispersal orders. So I think the process there is really important. We are also prosecuting a person named Zach X, who if I recall, broke somebody's jaw at Whipple. So we are prosecuting that gentleman, but it's difficult sometimes working. It can be a challenge working with local law enforcement when they have one idea and you have another. So we are having those conversations. In general, though, I think, and I've said this specifically a lot on national TV, that all the chaos that was here was caused by ICE and federal law enforcement. By and large, people here in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities know how to protest in a nonviolent, peaceful way. That is just the community here. There's always going to be somebody who does something that they shouldn't be doing, and those people will be investigated and maybe prosecuted. But the chaos was caused by federal agents, not by individuals here. And we need to recognize that what's happened here is traumatic and that people are going to have a traumatic response. Mm-hmm. They are going to want to protest. They're going to want to yell. They're going to want to say things. And they have that right. Can't go over the line of assaulting, obviously, something like that, but they do have that right. And sometimes it takes some work with local law enforcement to try to get that balance there.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. That's very important. We know that Minnesota has a culture of lifting up their First Amendment rights and protesting and organizing. And as you said before, seemed to really be one of the motivational factors to change the dynamics here on the ground was that organizing and protesting. So we certainly want people to feel protected in that right to stand up and say what they need to say. So thank you for those comments. We're getting close to time. I think we have about 10 minutes left. This has been insightful for me and interesting. Just want to take a minute to think about reflections and sort of your next steps. What do you feel like are some of the most significant lessons that you've learned from handling these investigations? And how do you think they'll influence the office's approach to future federal and state tensions, particularly as you think about your transition?
So I mentioned at some point, you asked me whether this will all be done while I'm still in office. And I think the answer is no. No matter what we do, I mean, this will be ongoing for some time. And so I think it's really important to elect someone who is going to carry on. Of course, I would think it's important to elect somebody who's going to carry on what we're doing. But in terms of reflections, and this is part of what I was saying to my colleagues across the country, I do think that, well, I don't know how anybody could be prepared to be the first Occupy. I mean, even what happened in LA or Chicago kind of paled in comparison to what we experienced here. And knowing this, one thing I said to my colleagues was, have the conversations with local law enforcement before this happens, because there was a whole lot of confusion, both in community and with local law enforcement about, I mean, when I had my conversations with law enforcement, they at first were saying they don't have jurisdiction. And I was saying, where do you get that? Because you do. And understandably, they're confused too. But having that conversation with local law enforcement, and so that you can get clear, what's going to happen if this happens? What if your community calls 911 and says ICE is kidnapping? Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to intervene? What are you going to tell your officers? Are you going to investigate? Those are critical questions and critical conversations that really should happen before something like this happens. We obviously didn't know this was going to happen, and we didn't have those conversations. So I think we missed out on opportunities to have law enforcement collect evidence that is no longer available to us. You know, for instance, the Minneapolis milestone cameras, which are in many different places, get recorded over after, I think it's 10 days or 2 weeks or something like that. So you really do want to try to collect all of the information that you can and really get law enforcement hopefully invested in doing investigations and, you know, intervening if they're willing to do that, but at least having those conversations. Because I think if you do that right away and you're prepared and you've educated yourself about, okay, what does it mean to investigate a federal agent, and what are the legal standards? What do you have to prepare for in federal court? If you're prepared for all of that, you're in a much better position than we were. And we're really privileged to be able to help the rest of the DAs around the country with that. And one thing we've done is talk to jurisdictions all over the country saying, hey, this is what we're doing. And because we really want to help people around the country understand, you know, what are the roadblocks they're going to face. So it's been really instructive for us, and we feel really positive about being able to share that information with other county attorneys here in Minnesota and DAs across the country.
Yeah, it's so important to really share those lessons learned as we think about, you know, the duration of what this federal administration's focus on immigration might look like and how it might roll out in other places. And as you said, just having a plan in place, I think, you know, in our work on violence prevention, we talk so much about the power of partnership. And really what you're describing is just that, right? That we need local agencies to have a game plan and to be talking ahead of time to do what's in the best interest of the community should something like this arise in their neck of the woods. So in your view, what steps are essential to safeguarding constitutional rights and community safety moving forward as we think about the aftermath here? And as you said, we know that, you know, the Metro Surge is over, the focus on this administration that they have on immigration has not changed, and there are still an increased number of officers present in Minnesota, but are there any next steps that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, you know, I go back to community. One of the reasons we opened up our portals, and that is also something that people across the country can do, DA's offices, to be prepared, is do the IT steps. I mean, I'm our IT department did that very quickly, but people have been recording, and that changes the game. Changes everything, because if you're not going to get cooperation from federal agencies, you've got community members out there who are documenting what's happening, and giving us that information and statements. And I would think, really, to protect people's constitutional rights, it is continuing to document. It is trying to get as much information as you can, about what you see, what's happening. You know, some of the interviews that the BCA has been doing, and the information we're trying to find out is, what did you hear people talking about? What were the federal agents saying? So collecting as much information and documenting it, for whatever the future holds, I think is really important. We have strong community. I mean, I can't even, like, we've had lawyers just step up and file habeas petitions that have never done that before to try to get people out. The legal community, like the ACLU, has filed lawsuits, civil lawsuits, to try to protect people's rights. So I think we're fortunate here to have strong organizations and a strong community where people are pitching in and trying to help in whatever way they can. But to be prepared for that and try to get organized for, okay, what happens if such and such happens? Who's gonna step up? Who's gonna do the training? And I think we've done a really remarkable job doing that, really quickly, but it's better to have the airplane built before you have to fly it. So I think planning, and I think to a certain extent, at least for me, like seeing some of the things that have happened here are just pretty shocking. And Sasha, it's like you said, and I think this about a lot of the Trump policies, they're illegal, but they're not illegal until a court says they are. So it's kind of like, yeah, they shouldn't be doing this, but who's going to stop it? And so thinking about those things, who's going to document it, who's going to intervene, who is going to do all those things, I think that kind of preparation is critical. And I'm amazed at the community for, doing all of the things that they did do so quickly under so much pressure. And it required courage. I mean, that's one of the things I left our local law enforcement with, because one of the things they did say was, we are concerned, some of our officers, what if they are arrested or worse? And I said, I get it. I totally get it. It's a new situation for you. And at the same time, you signed up to protect and serve your community, and your community showing up with whistles. And so I think, you have to have conversations about that.
Absolutely. And for the community, I think we can't say enough about organizing ahead of time, really getting to know your neighbors and where you have alignment on issues and where you can support one another in good and difficult times ahead of, any challenges. We know that challenges come, and that when community comes together, we can face those things head on in a different way. So for those who are listening, maybe from outside of the Twin Cities, and for our Twin Cities neighbors, continue to build those relationships. Training on mutual aid feels increasingly important, but most important is know who you live next door to and care about each other. So Mary, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation to have this conversation. It's been a pleasure to learn more about what your office is doing as it pertains to the aftermath of Metro Surge, and I will turn it back over to you all. Jen?
And thank you, Sasha, and thank you, Jen. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, my small little bit here just to wrap us all up. We're almost right at time, so that was really perfect. We hit it right on. But want to say thank you, to all of our community members and folks who joined us this evening to share and get more information, but also special thanks to you, Sasha, for helping us out here, and to you, Mary, for everything that you do. I feel honored to work in our office and be a part of everything that we do, big and small. And we hope that everyone had a chance to get more information, get a little bit enlightened. And I will just encourage folks to stay updated with us. Please visit us on our website at hennepinattorney.org. Follow us on our socials. Also sign up for updates. Our office sends out updates, newsletters, things like that. You can do that on our website as well. And a big thanks to all of our staff, my colleagues in the county attorney's office as well. We obviously don't do this work alone, and it takes all of us. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate you all and have a wonderful and safe evening.